please.
Great, thanks very much, Ken. I appreciate the introduction. I know in my short time today, I can't cover everything to do with crisis management and communication, but I'm going to try and cover a few key points. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'm going to start with a poll, if you don't mind. Has your organization's reputation or survival been at stake? Let me give you 15, 20 seconds to respond to that and see what the answers are. You've got 4 opportunities, some linked to COVID, some not linked to COVID. Great. Okay, so interestingly enough, 38% of people have not, or businesses, brands, have not so far had a crisis. Now, here's an interesting point. There is always a potential for a crisis to happen, so it's worthwhile looking at how to work on it. A good number, a significant proportion from COVID, but also from other incidents, and some who have not been impacted specifically by COVID, but have been impacted from some others. Okay, thank you very much for that poll, and thank you for the feedback. Can we move forward, please? I'm going to ask you to think about something, and by the time I finish my short segment today, I'd like to know if you have an answer for this question. Now, my question is, can you and or your team have a statement ready to be approved and disseminated to the media or other stakeholders by the time I finish speaking? Now, there's a very important reason I go to this, because time is of the essence when we look at any type of crisis communication and crisis management. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start with a few fun facts, and this is really to do with the fact that over the last few years, but increasingly so now, our lives have been taken over by social media. And it doesn't matter whether you are directly in connection with your end consumers through social media, they will find you. So a few facts that I quite like, that I use often: 76% of social media crises could have been avoided with proper planning and internal investment by companies. 80% of users want to connect with brands on Facebook, but 95% of Facebook wall posts are not answered by brands. And you'll be surprised, your brand or your business may actually have a Facebook presence without you even knowing about it. So beware for that. 56% of customer tweets to companies are being ignored. And 1/3 of CEOs fail to consider that their company's social media is relevant when reaching out to stakeholders to maintain reputation and to address crises. In fact, it becomes one of the best tools available for us. Can I have the next slide, please? So let's play a game. I'm hoping the first one will be relatively familiar. The second one may not. It's from a couple of years ago, and there's a couple of case studies here. And it brings me back to both Tesco, the supermarket, hypermarket, whatever you wish to call it, when they had rats in their chilies in the Old Klang Road outlet. It also brings me back to a little bakery in Mid-Valley that had a mouse inside its display units during opening hours. Now, these tiny little things actually caused significant issue for both the brands there. If we can move on to some slightly more serious case studies. About 2 or 3 years back, My Cafe, it's a brand based in Penang that was manufacturing specialist flavored coffees. 6 security guards at a Penang-based property got poisoned from drinking My Cafe. Now, the problem here was it took the authorities 6 days to investigate, despite My Cafe assuring everybody that all of their systems were controlled, that this was not possibly happening. It turned out to be that this was an angry lady, unrelated to the company, who was not happy for some reason with the security guards, and product tampering aftermarket. She purchased, she poisoned, she supplied. Now, the difficulty here was the My Cafe brand reputation suffered through 6 days. They lost customers, they lost opportunities. They had the Minister of Health saying it's a dangerous brand. all because they weren't able to, the authorities and them weren't able to track through what had happened and provide up-to-date information as fast as possible. Mammal Gold was one of the external external authorities who initiated a recall due to bacteria. And the third one, I'm sure we're all familiar with, the needles in the strawberries from Australia. Now, to my knowledge, there were less than 20 needles all up, but it shut down the Australian and New Zealand strawberry growing industry to the point that growers were dumping an entire season's worth of product because they could not figure out alternative ways to use it. The costs were in the multiple millions just from this particular incident. If we can move forward. The point that I want to make with that is at any stage along your supply chain, there can be a crisis that emerges. A crisis can emerge from either customers, the organization itself, so something that's happening within, or from your competitors. And interestingly enough, in 54% of crises, it is the customers who alert the brand or the organization. Other causes, the organization itself, we could be impacted from a regulatory authority or so forth, or our competitors are trying to stir up trouble. So within 1 hour, 36% of crises which meet the definition, i.e. there is the potential to impact or harm somebody's livelihood or well-being, 36% of crises have gone global. Now that's really scary, and that is because of social media. It takes on average 21 hours for the company to approve and respond to the situation. That means we have a 20-hour vacuum where other parties, the media, social media, keyboard warriors, are taking on board and controlling the narrative that our brand needs to be in charge of. So that's something, if you remember right at the beginning, could you prepare a statement within the time I'm speaking? You have to. We can't allow that 20-hour vacuum because that's where your reputation tanks, and that's a problem. And global figures, 52% of companies have not returned to the pre-crisis stock valuation within 1 calendar year. So the impact can be quite significant. If I can move on to the next slide, please. One of the interesting things is the industry, the communications industry, does research as to the identifiable risks that businesses and manufacturers, etc., face with respect to a crisis. And I just want to highlight the one in red, point number 2, product recall, safety, and packaging. In 2019 and 2020, this has been prioritized as an identifiable risk far more than previously. This same research that was done 10 years ago, recall, safety, and packaging, was a 3rd top priority. So it's shifting forward. You'll also notice that number 1, social influences, employee criticism, has gone from being something that was considered last on the list to being first. So a crisis doesn't necessarily come out of an issue with the product being seen by a consumer. It can come from our employees and others along our supply chain as well. But it's an interesting reversal of trends, and it showcases the need to be planning. Can I have the next slide, please? So a plan is very important, and many of our businesses will have a plan. Interestingly enough, at the end of last year, I did some dipstick research with Malaysian organizations. 80% of the organizations that I communicated with and specifically asked about their crisis management plan did not feel the need to have one. COVID proved us wrong. We need to have it. So a plan, a strong plan, must have the following 7 items. Risk assessment. This is where the overlap with business continuity planning comes in as well, because we are looking at what can go wrong and where we can move towards. We need to have a system that gathers information. So this might be social listening. This may be understanding what the trends are out in society. We need to make sure that we have contact for our crisis management team and that these people are aware of how to communicate to every stakeholder. We need to then have first hour, second hour, and ongoing communications. Many businesses fail in a crisis because they have not pre-prepared how they want to approach the media. So they are caught on the back foot. My preference is that we can plan a lot of this and even have media statements and stakeholder statements written in advance so that they are just edited should something go wrong, and we can therefore communicate much faster with the stakeholders that we need to talk to, and we can help get the media on side much faster as well. And the final thing that we need is team training. And what I've put down here is one collective voice or one narrative. The biggest failure with crisis communications and crisis management is when the team is not telling the same story. So for example, the CEO may say something, but then you'll get a mid-level person who's quite happy to not tell their name, but talk to the media and tell something different. So this is where working together as a team and training individuals so that they are all on the same track and have set rules actually helps you ride the crisis and be able to control that. May I have the next slide, please? So when a crisis emerges, we want to look at a few important things. We want to have a response framework. Who do we talk to first? How are they communicated with? What are the protocols? So this may mean utilizing social media, utilizing email. It may mean having a press conference, having an internal meeting with the teams, and so forth. We want to take control of the narrative. That means there is one voice. We've had some very high profile crises in Malaysia. The Malaysian Airlines, the 2 crashes, were one example where there were too many voices not telling the same story. And that's something that you must avoid at all costs. We want to look at how are we connecting to our stakeholders and the media, and the fact that the messaging we are giving both, although parallel, may not actually be the same message. What you need to tell financiers, what you need to tell suppliers is different than what you need to tell media, or maybe different to what you need to tell staff as well. We focus on sincerity and clarity. Remember, I come from a communications perspective. At the end of the day, you're judged on how you deliver, not the fact that you deliver. So it's very important to make sure that any communications is pre-planned to be both sincere and very transparent. And then finally, we want to look at the fact that there needs to be regularity and consistency. So the first 15, now this is again that question I asked right at the beginning. The first holding statement you can get out there within 15 minutes. The first hour communications, the second hour, and what you say as you go through. Now, have the next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on this aspect because I think for many of us listening today, although you are representing a brand, you may not be the B2C face. You may be part of a B2B supply chain before it becomes B2C. Media look at B2C mostly, which means our communications may be business to business or business to stakeholders. However, social media highlights everything. It doesn't matter. A great example will be from 2 weeks ago, that small tofu place in Puchong that was closed down because of unsanitary conditions. In fact, nobody knew the brand, nobody knew where they were, but they went viral very fast. At the end of the day, what's important though is the basis of the response must be H2H, and that is human to human. The best way to evolve out of a crisis is to communicate on a way that everybody is comfortable with and feels the humanity, the compassion, and so forth for it. Your audience becomes your stakeholders, those with a financial interest at any scale, whether supplier, down the line, staff. It becomes media, and it becomes consumers. So we need to address these individuals in different ways. And proper planning will actually help you to identify the methods and the channels to address these particular different audiences. May I have the next slide, please? There are 6 characteristics of good crisis management. Decisive corrective action. That means you act fast. It's timely and accurate information that you put across. You have the ability to admit mistakes. Acknowledging that something went wrong actually humanizes the brand to its audiences. You have a full appreciation of all stakeholders. You have a clear recovery strategy, which links into the business continuity planning and consistent corporate messages. So that comes from the one voice. May I move forward, please? So I come back to the one question. Can you and your team have a statement ready and approved and disseminated by the time I finish speaking? I have now finished. Ask yourself, you don't need to tell me the answer, ask yourself, could you? If you couldn't, feel free to touch base with me.